Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us on today's webinar. Sarah, you think we can get started?
Yep, let's get started.
Cool. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about our LLM products and introducing also a brand new product and also having a little chat on research on generative AI challenges. Cool. So it's nice to meet all of you. I'm Teresa Datta. I'm one of the machine learning engineers primarily focused on research at Arthur.
I'm Sarah. I'm what we call a field data scientist, so more of a customer-facing data scientist, kind of helping all of our end users and even just our enterprise customers to really get started with our products.
Awesome. So today we have a pretty brief agenda for everybody. We'll be walking through a product demo, having a little bit of time for question and answers about our product demo, having a small fireside chat on current and nascent challenges in generative AI, and then finally wrapping up with another opportunity to ask any questions that you may have. Cool. Sarah, want to take it away for our Arthur Shield and Arthur chat demo?
Absolutely. You can go ahead and unshare screen. I'll open up our demo here. All right. Awesome. So thanks everyone for joining. So today I'm going to be walking you through a demo of our newly launched LLM product, Arthur Chat. So just kind of as a general overview, Arthur Chat provides this interface for users to interact with an LLM on top of your proprietary documents and with our Shield checks built directly into the interface. So it works a lot like any of those kind of browser-based chatbots you may have already used, think ChatGPT, but you've got a few extra features on top of that. So we'll dive into that today. So when you log in to Arthur Chat, you'll start kind of seeing the screen. Looks kind of just like a chatbot. Over on the right-hand side panel, though, this is really where your user can see the documents that exist in their underlying data store. So Arthur Chat uses retrieval-augmented generation to provide relevant information from this data store, from these documents that are accessible then to the underlying LLM. And so this is all happening in real time during the user's chat interactions. So the user is actually able to manage these documents, decide which ones they want the chatbot to actually talk to, and they can also add brand new documents if they need to during the interaction. So let's dive into an example, and actually I'll open this back up again. I've started by onboarding this IPCC climate report document that I want to query this LLM about. So this is kind of an example of the type of really kind of dense technical domain-specific data that someone may want to query an LLM about. So that's meant to be the example. Now I'm going to start with a prompt that someone might want to ask of this LLM regarding this document. So here I'm asking, I apologize. Let's see. Go through again. What is the impact of climate change on adaptation strategies? So I've looked at this document already. I know that this information is in here, so I expect everything to work out well. And as we can see, the LLM here was able to generate a response. Let's dive into what's happening here with Arthur Shield kind of on the backside of this, right? So if we look in here, we can see this prompt that I sent in passed our Shield checks. So let's just go briefly through each of these. I'll give examples related to all these checks, but it's passed this PII, this private data rule, toxicity, sensitive data, and a prompt injection rule. So nothing shady at all about this prompt that I sent in. And then on the response side, we can see we've got hallucination, toxicity rule, and PII all set up. And it passed on all of these, as I kind of expected. I knew this information was provided in that document, right? So going just a little bit into what's happening here, when we click on this context button, we can actually see where specifically from that IPCC report this response was generated from. So where we're accessing this LLM is accessing the information in this document. Now, if we go ahead and dive a little bit deeper into the hallucination rule here, we can see that what happened was Arthur Shield actually broke each of the claims made in this response into individual claims and checked that each of these were supported by this context that we've got added here. So a lot more kind of underside there, but I'm going to move on to another one of our checks. So one of the other risks that a lot of our customers are concerned about is that leakage of sensitive information or private data. So for example, personally identifiable information is a really big concern and a legal risk to a certain extent with LLMs. So there's a concern both for the data contained in prompts that are being sent into an LLM and also in the responses of leakage on the response of private data. So we're going to give an example here where somebody is actually trying to send private information into this LLM. So here I'm asking, is it possible to assess my credit score based on my social security number? And then I actually provide my social security number. So generally not an advisable thing to do, but just in case, we can see that we're checking on this. So here on the prompt side, we can see that this actually failed a couple of our rules. It failed on the sensitive data rule because we're adding sort of individual specific information here. And also on the PII rule, because we did show our actual social security number. Now, on the response side, we can see everything passed. And looking at the response from this LLM, it responded appropriately. It didn't actually provide any private data, right? So it's kind of what we'd expect that this would pass. And this is pretty common. Most LLMs on the market today, including the one used in this demo, are designed to avoid private information leakage. So we don't usually see PII coming out on the responses. But this PII rule works the same both for the prompts and for the responses. So if anything did leak out of this LLM, we would cache it just like we caught it on the prompt side. So for the next one, I'm actually going to uncheck this document since we don't want to be asking about climate change anymore. And we're going to move on to sensitive data. So, in the case of PII, often we've got a fairly well-defined kind of format of PII or a sense of like what exactly we mean. But there are a lot of cases where we have broader, maybe less defined topics that we want to flag as private. And so that's really where the sensitive data rule comes in. So to give an example of this, I'm going to put in a prompt that is kind of a little bit more nuanced, but it is still something we would want to maybe block someone from asking an LLM about. So here we're saying, can you access my medical record and tell me what my blood type is? So obviously, this is something we wouldn't want an LLM to reveal. And as we can see here, this did pass that PII rule since we don't have sort of a specific PII that we're sharing here, but we are failing the sensitive data rule. And so while this passed on the response side, since this LLM did respond appropriately, we did want to block anyone from really asking about this type of private data, right? And so here with the sensitive data rule, Arthur Shield can be customized to detect specific types of sensitive data, and that's really easy to adjust depending on the use case. So in our Arthur chat application, we've set up a rule that detects individual specific information, and it actually lets through sort of general information about the same topic. So while in this case with sensitive data, we do detect sort of this prompt asking about an individual's blood type, we actually do allow questions about blood type in general to pass. And so as an example of that, I'm just going to give her another prompt here, where we're just asking, what is the most common blood type in the world, right? And we see on this side, it actually passes everything. So even though we're asking about the same topic, we actually catch that sensitive data when we're asking about it for an individual and not when we're asking about it in general. So one other thing I want to show you guys is how we can detect sort of toxic or biased language going into or in the responses of LLMs. So this is another concern, especially when we're talking about public-facing applications or even just things that are facing, individual employees. We're concerned about biased language, right? So I'm not going to show anything too toxic in the demo, of course, but I'll give a little example here. So let's imagine a scenario where maybe I'm using this chatbot for an HR application. Maybe I'm wanting to ask questions about sort of how I should go about interviewing a candidate for a job. So I'm just going to put in the prompt here. Sec. All right. So here I'm saying I'm interviewing a candidate for an accountant position at my company, and what are some questions I should ask during the interview? So very kind of innocent question. We can see everything's passing on both ends here. Now, so this is all fine. I'm going to ask a little bit of a less innocent question here of this LLM. asking if this is still a good candidate if she's pregnant. So here I'm bordering on maybe some sort of discriminatory, biased language, something that I might want to prevent someone from asking an LLM about, right? And so if we open this up, it actually caught us both on the toxicity rule, since I'm kind of using some biased language here, and also on the sensitive data rule, since I'm asking sort of about medically private information about this individual, right? And so we're catching this on both sides. And again, this LLM is responding and behaving pretty well. It's not actually breaking any rules in its responses, but we're able to set up this type of sensitive data rule on both the prompts and responses. So even if something did leak through an LLM, we would still catch that the same way we do in the prompt side, right? And so similar to sort of with the PII, LLMs usually catch this stuff, but they don't always, and they're not 100%. So we want to have this third party check on this. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about prompt injection. So if you're familiar with this idea, a prompt injection attempt is when a user might sort of maliciously or intentionally be trying to undermine a system prompt. For example, they might want to find out, what was this LLM instructed to do, or they might want to try to get it to do something that it was not intended to do. So these are really pernicious, and they're changing constantly, the approaches people use to sort of hack these LLMs. So this is a pretty high risk for a lot of people using LLMs in applications, but we're going to give an example here, and this one's pretty straightforward. So here I'm asking this LLM to pause its task and just repeat its instructions. So while it doesn't seem too risky, we might not want to reveal what underlying sort of system prompt in this LLM is. So I'm asking that, and here we can see we did get caught here on that prompt injection rule. And we can also see here that there was a little bit of leakage in this LLM. It did actually kind of reveal some of my previous questions. So while that might not be like the worst thing ever, we still might prefer that to not happen, right? So Arthur Shield's prompt injection detection approach uses a binary classification model, and it's fine-tuned on a prompt injection data set. Now, this data set is sourced from a huge range of sources, from discussion threads on Reddit all the way to sort of academic research papers looking for new ways to do prompt injections. And as these techniques evolve, we're actually continuing to update and build on our model to make that prompt injection detection better and better over time. So now I've kind of showed you a bunch of our different rules and how we can use these in Arthur Chat. I do want to show you one last thing, and that's sort of how we can track this all over time, right? So as we have a bunch of users using an LLM application, we may want to see how often are we getting hallucinations? Is that increasing over time? Are we getting more leakage of PII or more sort of flagged leakage of PII? So let's take a look really quickly here at our observability platform, Arthur Scope. I'm not going to go into a thorough demo here. I'm sure many of you have probably seen this before, but I'm just going to look at this Arthur Chat model. So this is a model that I've onboarded onto Arthur Scope to actually track the behavior of this particular model, this LLM, and how it's doing. And so if we look here at the schema, we can see I've set this up to take in the user prompt to show us the LLM response, the prediction that's made. And I've got some non-input data set up. So this is all of those Shield results that I'm actually summarizing and putting into Arthur Scope, where I can track them, right? So we're looking at sensitive data on the prompt, toxicity rules on the prompt, all of these sort of hallucination rules on the response. So we're looking at both the response and the prompt side for all of these different rules. And so looking at performance with LLMs, it can be pretty hard to actually know what to look at for performance, but I've set up some custom metrics that I'm interested in for this model. And the couple here, so we've got a hallucination rate, a prompt injection rate, a PII rate, trying to see maybe there are some changes happening in how much PII leakage I get over time. So I can select one of these custom metrics and see whether this has changed, right? And as we can see, it looks like there's been a little bit more PII, and this is our demo model, so we expect kind of high rates since we're showing these. But really great way to actually track LLM performance in a world where it's really hard to keep track of how well LLMs are actually doing. So the last thing I want to show here is just how we can look at individual inferences, right? So diving into the inferences deep dive, we can take a look at individual prompts, individual responses, and then how Shield has sort of treated these, whether it passed or failed on all of these different rules that we have set up. So with that, I'm actually going to end the demo here. And we can switch back onto the PowerPoint, and I'm open to any questions anyone's got about the demo I just gave. And if we have no questions, we can move on to the fireside chat.
Sarah, I think we do have a question, yeah.
Okay, sorry, I missed that.
It asks, is Shield customizable to my own rules?
Yes. Yeah. So if you want to sort of set up your own specific rules, we have a number that are sort of pre-made that you're able to sort of just take and put in, but you can also create custom rules. So if you've got maybe specific words that you want to block or specific types of formats, specific types of PII, maybe, you're able to set up those specifically and decide whether you want them on the prompts, on the response, on both. And we also allow a lot of customizability with the sensitive data rule. You can really sort of define specific topics that you're interested in blocking there. So yeah, plenty of customizability there.
Awesome. And then Gaurav asks, what about any vulnerabilities that might exist in the LLMs?
I'm not entirely sure what that question means, but yeah, so if you've got vulnerabilities within an LLM specifically, that's not something that Shield is designed to block against. I would certainly want to, recommend in that case to kind of be careful about the LLM provider that you're using. But the prompt injection rule will help to sort of prevent things from being released from that. But yeah, that might be a case where you're wanting to watch out about your provider.
Yeah. And another question is on the hallucination check. And one asker asks, is there an hallucination example? And then also, how does the hallucination check work? I can talk a little bit about how the hallucination check works. So our hallucination check essentially is a Arthur-specific framework where we break up the text into specific substatements and then check the individual substatements for the accuracy in comparison to a provided context. So it does require a document or a contextual piece of information to check the provided input text on. Are there any specific examples that you could go over, Sarah?
Yeah, so with the hallucinations, the reason why I actually did not show you an actual hallucination example is because that underlying LLM has been too good lately, and we cannot get it to actually hallucinate. So good problem to have. It's a case where we're just having a hard time getting it to actually hallucinate. But that's why we didn't give you sort of a failure example on that one. But there are cases where, depending on what type of LLM you're using, those can come up more often, especially if you're using sort of a smaller one. Right now, I think we're hooked up to GPT 3.5, and that one works pretty well. But yeah, we'll move on to the next question.
Cool. So how do you work with companies in regulated spaces?
Yeah, so with regulated spaces, I think oftentimes the main risk is while we're wanting to prevent sort of leakage of data from an LLM, we also don't want to be releasing data onto the cloud, onto Arthur maybe even, right? So what we often do is we actually have an on-prem option where we can have all this stuff, Shield, Scope, your own LLM running all in an air-gapped environment on-prem, where there's no risk of that information actually leaving the environment. So that's definitely a deployment option that we offer because of that sort of huge kind of important data privacy aspect.
And finally, can I onboard my own LLMs and do the same rules that are supported on the platform?
Yeah, absolutely. So these aren't sort of specific to a particular LLM. This can be designed with your own whatever LLM you happen to be using. So there's definitely a lot of flexibility with that.
Awesome. Cool.
All right. Shall we move on to the fireside chat?
Yeah, kind of switching gears a little bit. Awesome. I am really excited to be chatting a bit today, Sarah.
Yeah, definitely. It's an exciting time and an exciting topic. So yeah, I think one of the things we want to talk about is just kind of start talking about recapping of LLMs and AI in 2023. We all know a lot of big things have happened in this past year. So I do want to ask Teresa what she sees as the biggest breakthroughs in AI over this past year. What are the things you're most excited about?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think it's really just one word, which is LLMs. It's really difficult to remember that ChatGPT only launched on November 30th of 2022. I saw a recent tweet of Sam Altman celebrating the first birthday of ChatGPT. but it's really only been a little over a year, and it really has launched a huge AI arms race with big players like Microsoft, Google, and new names, Anthropic, Cohere, and more, Meta, of course, and launched a whole new series of conversations. But on the other hand, there's also been copyright lawsuits against generative AI companies, policies, regulations, Biden's executive order on AI. I'm really intrigued to see how that will continue to shift the landscape. And from our home ground, Arthur has pivoted and released 3 new products in the LLM space. In addition to Scope, our monitoring tool, we also have Bench, Shield, and Chat, which all focus on different vulnerabilities present in LLM-specific use cases.
Yeah, it's been a wild year, I think, both for Arthur and for just the AI space in general. And I think another thing that comes to mind for me is like the EU AI Act just passed, and that's been, you know, kind of, at least in my mind, for like a pretty long time. So going on.
I do see one hand up from Goran. Yeah, feel free to jump in with any questions or comments.
Oh, I see. Is this I think a leftover question about the on-prem solution? Sorry, this is a leftover chat one, but I can answer that. How does the on-prem solution scale with when we have several cloud accounts? You know what? That might be one to dive into a little bit later, just because we want to be talking more at a broad level than the sort of specifics. But feel free to reach out to our team and we can answer that question. Cool. All right. Let's see. So I guess the other thing I do want to see kind of what your perspective is on is what challenges do you sort of have you seen come up with this sort of all this new stuff in AI? What do you see as the biggest challenges that we're facing right now or have faced?
Yeah. So from a research perspective and from somebody who's really passionate about trust and transparency in large algorithmic systems, I think there's a lot of areas of ongoing concern and research that are necessary. So I think the ways in which LLMs produce outputs can yield actively harmful results. And I think we've already seen that. And it's kind of reached like a cultural tipping point in some ways. And there's been a lot of work to address some of the active harm directly outputted from bias or toxicity in the outputs. And of course, Arthur itself has tackled it in its own ways. But I'm also really interested to see how humans interacting with LLMs might yield socio-technical systems that could result in potentially harmful behavior. And so I'm interested to see what our definitions of like harmful or toxic, how those shift in the future. One really unfortunate challenge and really terrible challenge is the toll on human workers to identify toxic behavior. Karen Howe has been writing some amazing pieces on the toll of content labelers and data labelers, and the emotional labor that's like required to build these intense data sets. So I think there's a lot of ongoing humanitarian concerns and ongoing research challenges, all related to kind of identifying toxic, discriminatory, biased behaviors. But I'm really curious to see, I think it has reached a huge cultural moment in society. So I'm really interested to see like how that will continue beyond kind of our what the checks have already encountered so far, if that makes sense. And I don't think we mentioned this before, but if you do have any questions or have any comments, feel free to raise a hand or to post the question in the Q&A. We'll have a little question and answering section at the end of this chat.
All right. Yeah, I love that you kind of talked about like some of those the articles about sort of how actually annotating toxic data is a problem kind of by itself. So like that's an article I read about too, and thought was really interesting and a little bit concerning. So kind of good thing to bring to light. But yeah, so I know you have helped sort of develop some of our own data leakage detection approaches. Could you tell us a little bit more about how that works?
Yeah. And actually, I see there's a question about the PII check. So this is a perfect question to ask, Sarah. So yeah, so of the checks that Sarah kind of outlined, I think it would be really interesting to kind of do a deeper dive on the sensitive data check and the PII check, because on the surface, when I like first heard the words sensitive data and PII, in my head, I was kind of like, what's the difference? But there is actually a difference. So PII stands for personal identifying information, and these are groups of attributes that are pre-outlined in regulations by different federal government levels. These are like specific aspects of specific attributes of information, like your social security number, your address, your email. These are things that are going to be actually identifying. And so for PII, we use rule-based approaches in combination with regex or regular expressions, and as well as a little bit of context. So for instance, if you have a sentence that says my social security number is blah, 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 we'll combine that aspect that you have said the word social security number to detect it as social security, or to give it a higher probabilistic score that it is a social security number that's being listed. Whereas sensitive data, we're really defining that as something that is custom tailored to your specific enterprise's needs. So sensitive data, to me, it's entirely context dependent. And so if you're a healthcare company, like Sarah showed in the example, sensitive data might have more to do with medical records or specific pharmaceutical labeling systems or health records. And so our sensitive data approach specifically requires specific examples and is custom tailored to your enterprise needs, because a healthcare company's definition of what is sensitive is going to be very different from a financial company's definition of what's sensitive. And we want to be entirely cognizant of that and recognizing of that. So I think this is really the key distinction. Sensitive data is going to be custom tailored and much more context dependent. And PII, although it does incorporate a little bit of, I would say, like micro context, is more rule-based, regex, and we're checking against a list of specific attributes. So it's a nascent but important space. And Sarah, I know that you've been doing a lot of work in guiding enterprises through these challenges. I know we've had a lot of really exciting customer conversations. How has your experience been in guiding enterprises through these challenges?
Yeah, I think like one of the things that does stand out is just how different data leakage, this topic of privacy is between sort of generative AI and sort of our more traditional, what we might call classic AI models, right? Machine learning. So because we've always known there was a risk of privacy, breaches with AI and ML models. They're trained on all this data, and there's a risk that can actually come out, even though it's been trained into a model. But with classic machine learning models, the outputs are constrained. There's, you kind of need some technical skill to actually get private data out of them. And so we have, even though there is still a risk, and we do have to be mindful of privacy with those types of models, this changes so much when we get to Gen AI, where like we can't control what the outputs really are. We only have so much control, right? And so we've got these generative responses coming out. We've got less control over even our training data in some cases, since we're pulling often these models aren't ones that are like our own organizations trained. They were trained externally. And so there's a lot of risk of data just being leaked by accident without someone even trying to do that. You don't need to be intending to kind of get private data, or you don't need to have that much technical skill. So I think there's just a lot more risks, and that extends to a bunch of other, all kind of other topics as well, where we just have a little bit less control over these models, and a lot more can happen. We just can't really predict it that well. So that's kind of the main thing that I see being a lot different with the LLM space. And that's where we really do need like layers of guardrails on these things to make sure that we can really kind of control what is coming out of them. But yeah, let's move on and kind of think about what's happening next year. So yeah, I'm curious on your thoughts about what practitioners should be thinking about as we head into 2024.
Yeah, 2024, big year, big number. To me, I'm really interested in how the community will adapt to multimodal. So for those who might not be familiar with this term, multimodal is models that combine multiple types of information. So you might have images and tabular, or images and text. And we're starting to see, obviously we have like awesome image generators, and we have video generators now, but when we're combining multiple types of information, I think the definitions that we have defined for these like harmful behaviors that we've discussed are not as clear cut. So for instance, in our shield checks, we have checks like sensitive data, PII, etc. But I don't think we have strong definitions for those for image generation. Like, what does data leakage for image generation look like? What does like PII for tabular data sets really look like? And how do we combine those checks when there's multiple sources, types of information present in like inputs and outputs for multiple modalities? So I think, yeah, I think working to define and craft guardrails for handling what seems like the trend is of larger and larger capabilities, I think that'll be really top of mind, at least for me. Sarah, what about you though?
Yeah, I
Oh,
mean,
and also, one last thing. I noticed we did have a raised hand, and I think maybe it'd just be easier if folks could send in their questions in the Q&A feature. We'll have a section for questions after our little chat, but I think that might make things a little bit smoother. But Sarah, what are you looking forward to for next year?
yeah, I think I'm really excited to just see how kind of industries and how enterprises are starting to think about really putting these LLMs into production, because I think we've been at this phase where everyone kind of wants to try something. They're maybe experimenting, maybe doing some beta testing, and some have already started putting things into production. But yeah, I'm excited to kind of see how that plays out over the next year. Are there going to be more concerns of sort of the cost versus the value, more sort of pruning of the use cases, finding things that maybe are really the real valuable use cases, and kind of what that ends up being, especially as we go into multimodal. Like, I don't know what that's going to look like, but I think it'll change a lot in the next year, just like it has in the past year. So yeah, just looking at those things, looking at what's worth the cost and also what's worth the risk, right? We know we've highlighted a number of risks, and there might be some scenarios where something's just too high risk to actually put into production. So that's one that I'm curious to see. But yeah, really excited to just see kind of what there is, how industries are thinking about making these applications continue to be safe for those that are using them, safe for the data, safe for the companies, and also performant. How can we make sure that they're actually doing what we expect them to, and performing well? And just like classic machine learning, I think monitoring is going to be a huge part of this. I think we'll see companies starting to sort of integrate these into their own kind of MLOps systems. Well, they'll want to monitor, to track behavior, to see how well things are doing, make updates, and iterate on these and make them better over time. So I think more mature applications are going to be super exciting to see in the next year.
Yeah, totally.
But yeah, with that, do you have anything else to add, Teresa?
No, I'm excited to see what folks in the audience want to talk about, but
Sure.
well, I guess we'll see what happens next year, Sarah.
We will see. All right.
I'll share a little thank you slide for everybody. But if folks have any questions, I'll pull up the Q&A. Okay, so somebody's asking, I definitely noticed that the capabilities of LLMs to limit biased or toxic or harmful outputs has increased over time. Wait, where did the question go? Why is it still important to have this additional layer of protection? Yeah, super accurate and fair. And even Sarah mentioned that like the abilities of models to hallucinate has severely decreased over time. And we do know that to be the case. But I think there's two main like keys to why having this additional layer of protection is really important. I'm just going to stop so I can see the questions. So two key reasons. One is that using a third-party detector like Arthur Shield allows you to have protection on your inputs. And so as has been unfortunately the case, these inputs are oftentimes like stored and used for future training data. So you don't want your enterprise to be leaking sensitive information about maybe your trade secrets or your enterprise information and leaking those back to the LLM provider. So this protects against the inputs. And additionally, involving a third party can add another layer of protection because you're basically you have an additional check to make sure that it's not just the LLM provider that is handling to see whether there's toxic or biased information, but this is like a third party. And so that's something that we've heard from our customers as being really valuable. Okay, next question. From a research standpoint, what other potential challenges beyond the four Arthur already covers do you think we might encounter in the coming year or years? Okay, this is a great question. So one thing that I didn't mention, I know we talked a little bit about multimodal and kind of value versus cost. But one thing that I don't know if that we really touched on is some aspects of like copyright and citation and sourcing. And so I know that there have been quite a few high profile lawsuits of artists and creators and writers kind of suing for copyright. But I'm really curious how LLM providers might tackle that from an LLM standpoint of providing citations or kind of like explainability or interpretability on their LLMs. And I know that there are some LLM providers who are like specifically providing like citations, like I can name a few, and providing like some sources along with their answer. And so, but I'm curious to see how that continues to develop and grow. And maybe in the future, we'll have like a copyright check on our LLM responses. Like if the response is potentially liable to copyright or something, I think that could be like really interesting. And I'm curious to see like how those lawsuits play out. Sarah, anything that is like on your mind about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've got a similar perspective. I think I'm curious about, yeah, the copyright side of things. I think we haven't really gotten into it all yet. As well as like, I mean, yeah, there are some other like risks that are difficult for Arthur to approach, right? Such as like the sourcing of data and that type of thing. So I think there's some that, you know, maybe sort of extend outside of Arthur, but are still things that I'm a little concerned about, right? How are we sort of even getting these toxic data sets or yeah, those types of things that Teresa kind of mentioned. So I think there's a lot to think about with these, but we're moving forward and a lot of progress has been made in the last year. So excited for that.
Cool. Looks like there's some technical questions on the Arthur platform. Do you offer the solution SaaS and or can deploy on-prem and private cloud?
Yeah, so those are both options that we offer with both Shield and Scope. So yeah, definitely depending on what's sort of important to what your situation is, we can handle both of those cases.
Yeah. Okay. And then somebody asks, we are using in-house 2 different LLM platforms. Can I onboard both? And if yes, which LLM providers do you support?
That might be one to dive into a little bit more detail with our with our team kind of individually, since that's kind of a specific question. So I think I'll pass on that one partly because I'm not familiar with how well or like how 2 of these would be handled or exactly what you mean with LLM platforms. But yeah, dive into that. Maybe even reach out to our team and see if we can work with you specifically to figure out what your situation is. But
I will comment on the second part of the question. We are not LLM provider specific. So the Arthur Shield platform kind of acts as a sandwich around your LLM call. So it's not specific to any like LLM provider. If you have your own in-house LLM, it will still work. If you're using Claude or ChatGPT, it'll still work. But I also am not quite sure I'm the best person about 2 different LLMs.
yeah, I mean for Shield, it should be you should have no problem with 2. I'm not sure about how exactly it's set up with chat, but that would be something to dive into in more depth. Is copyright something cloud service providers would cover? This is probably the reason we would want to go with CSP hosted. Okay, so you're asking whether copyright is something covered by cloud service providers. Right now, it's not entirely yet. I think, yeah, I'm sure that's something that like is something that these cloud providers are also working on, and trying to avoid. But we have seen copyrighted data in the data sets that these models are trained on. So we don't know for sure that it is necessarily covered, and often these data sets are not necessarily transparent. So when you're working with ChatGPT, you don't necessarily know all of the models or all the data that it was trained on. So it's hard to be 100% sure that it's not actually trained on copyright data. Any thoughts on that, Teresa?
No, definitely. I think even from if the liability falls on the cloud service providers, I think that there is an additional third-party check. I think that could be like a really interesting future frontier. Obviously, it's not something that we're currently working on.
Not covered it yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Any last minute questions? Otherwise, I think it'll be good to wrap it up. All right. I think we're good to go.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. Oh, it looks like we have one last question. How many users can simultaneously log in and work?
I don't believe we actually have a limitation on that. You know, obviously the cost will vary depending on how many users you've got logging in, but there's not like a strict limit to that. But yeah, feel free to you know, reach out to us and follow up with any other, you know, specific questions you have. Good.
Cool. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your Monday and great holiday season.